Hello, and welcome back to SilentEcho. On the last day of her junior year, a 17-year-old girl stepped out of school in Phoenix, Arizona, and vanished into a story that still has not found its ending. There was no mountain trail, no storm front, no wrecked car by a canyon road, no lonely stretch of coastline. There was only a bright, suburban afternoon, a school campus, a boyfriend in a workshop class, a stepfather who said he picked her up early, a bedroom that would later appear disturbed, and a note that seemed to explain everything too quickly. It said she had gone to California. It pointed the case in one direction before the search had really begun. For a while that note almost became the case itself. But the longer people sat with it, the stranger, everything around it began to feel. She left behind the ordinary things a teenager does not usually leave behind when she is planning a real escape. Her money stayed where it was, her car stayed where it was, her phone stayed behind. So did her makeup and jewelry and clothes. The note gave the world an answer. The rest of the room gave the world a question. And the most unnerving part was this. The last person authorities say definitely saw Alissa Turney alive was the man who helped frame the very first explanation for why she was gone. Some disappearances become mysteries because there are too many possibilities. Others become mysteries because almost everything seems to narrow toward a single center, and yet that center never opens. The story of Alissa Turney lives in that second category. It is not just the story of a missing teenager. It is the story of how a case can be shaped in its first few hours and then haunted by that shape for decades. It is the story of a family that spent years trapped inside competing versions of reality. One version said a girl ran away. Another said she was never given the chance. One version rested on a note. Another rested on what people later said they knew about the house she lived in and the man who controlled it. One version ended with California. The other had no ending at all. And as the years passed, the gap between those two versions did not close. It widened. By the time the case led to a homicide prosecution in 2020, the mystery had hardened into something more difficult than uncertainty. It had become a void lined with accusation, but starved of the one thing the legal system still needed: proof. Phoenix is not the kind of place people usually imagine when they think about vanishings that turn into dark folklore. It is not a remote park. It is not a northern wilderness. It is a city built on light and heat and long roads. In May, the school year edges toward its end under a sky that already feels close to summer. The neighborhoods of North Phoenix can seem open and ordinary in that way many suburban landscapes do. Broad streets, shopping plazas, school parking lots, driveways, cinder block walls, places where everyday life looks visible and understandable. That familiarity matters here because Alissa did not disappear in a place that looked dangerous. She disappeared from the middle of an ordinary routine. That is one reason the case lingers. It unsettles the assumption that danger announces itself. In this story, danger, if it existed, did not come from the edge of the map. It came from inside a normal day, a normal school schedule, a normal ride, a normal home. The geography of the case has always carried that contradiction. It feels domestic and exposed at the same time. No one had to imagine a remote landscape swallowing a person whole. They had to imagine a teenage girl moving through daylight and then simply no longer existing in any reliable way beyond it. Alissa Turney was 17 in the spring of 2001. By the accounts that survive, she was not a faceless symbol built after the fact for a missing person poster. She had friends. She had a boyfriend. She drew. She loved animals. She listened to hard rock. She worked part-time. She was old enough to think seriously about life outside the home and young enough to still be living under the rules of adults who could control nearly every hour of her day. That combination matters because the months before a disappearance often tell you whether someone was moving toward a future or moving away from one. In Alissa's case, the answer depends on who is speaking. The runaway explanation says she was unhappy and decided to leave before 18. The opposing view says she was saving money and planning for a more ordinary departure later. Not a desperate flight, not a disappearing act, just the slow preparation of a teenager who wanted out. That distinction sits near the heart of the mystery. If she was preparing to leave on her own terms, then the note reads one way. If she had truly reached a breaking point and bolted in secret, then it reads another. But even there, the case resists easy certainty. What made the home feel restrictive? What exactly she feared? What she may have confided to friends? Which memories hardened into testimony only later? All of that remains filtered through years of grief, suspicion, and retrospective meaning. Still, a consistent theme runs through those later recollections. People close to Alissa did not remember a girl who seemed likely to vanish without a trace and never touch her money or belongings again. By the time Alissa disappeared, the family had already lived through loss. Her mother had died years earlier, and Michael Turney had become the dominant adult figure in the house. He was a former sheriff's deputy and later an electrician. Over the years, family members and friends would describe the home environment in ways that made outsiders uneasy. Sarah Turney, who was younger and would later become the public force behind the case, said that as a child she absorbed the atmosphere without fully understanding it. Some things only looked ominous in retrospect. Some things looked controlling even at the time. During later testimony and interviews, Sarah described hidden cameras and phone recordings inside the home and a level of monitoring that she came to see not as protection but as surveillance. Michael denied wrongdoing and has long maintained his innocence. He has said cameras were for security. That dispute matters because this case is filled with details that can either sound like proof of a dark secret or sound like the suspicious reinterpretation of a family that came to believe the worst after a disappearance. This is one of the weakest and most dangerous edges of the story. It is easy to make it feel cleaner than it is. The reality is messier. There are allegations. There are memories. There are statements from witnesses. There is behavior many people found disturbing. But there is no single hidden camera or recording that solves the case. There is only a pattern that investigators and relatives later argued helped explain why Alissa may have been vulnerable in the very place where she was supposed to be safest. The day itself begins with a deceptive calm of routine. May 17, 2001, the last day of Alissa's junior year at Paradise Valley High School. The date matters because last days of school carry their own atmosphere. They feel transitional, half real and half already fading into summer. In almost any missing person case, the final day becomes painfully over-examined later. Every class, every hallway, every brief exchange, every word that in the moment meant nothing and afterward seems like the beginning of a cliff. According to the official missing person entry, Alissa was last seen at approximately 11 in the morning at school in the area of North 34th Street and East Bell Road. According to the account repeated through police records and later reporting, she poked her head into her boyfriend John's woodshop class and told him her stepfather was taking her out of school early. It was not framed as an emergency. It was not delivered like a goodbye. It was an ordinary sentence in an ordinary setting. The kind that would vanish from memory in any other life. But in this one, it became the last independent sighting anyone can point to with confidence. That short moment with John is one of the cleanest pieces of the timeline and also one of the most haunting. Many cases become difficult because the last sighting is blurred. Here it is specific enough to feel solid and yet not specific enough to tell us what came next. She is at school. She is alive. She appears calm enough to stop by a class and relay a message. She says Michael is picking her up. From that point on, the narrative narrows sharply. Michael later told police he took Alissa out for lunch. He said they argued. He said he dropped her back at home around 1 in the afternoon. That account created the last known arc of her day. If true, it means the disappearance either began inside the house after he left or after she decided to leave it. If false, it means the case bent into darkness much earlier than originally believed. There is no neutral answer in between. One of the most unsettling features of the story is how quickly the number of uncontested facts runs out. By early afternoon, the timeline is already dependent on the account of one man. Then by evening, that same man is telling police his stepdaughter has run away. That evening, Michael reported Alissa missing and explained that she had left a note saying she was heading to California. California was not a random destination. Alissa had an aunt there. That mattered because it gave the note a plausible anchor. It did not read like fantasy. It read like a teenage decision. For investigators at the time, this was enough to push the case into the familiar category of runaway. And once a case enters that category, every hour that follows becomes harder to reclaim. A runaway is thought to have agency. A runaway is thought to have chosen distance. A runaway is not met with the same urgency as an abduction or an unexplained disappearance. That classification can become a lens that distorts everything that comes after it. In Alissa's case, the note did more than offer an explanation. It dictated the emotional weather of the house. Sarah Turney would later say that when she found the note, she believed it. She was young and hurt and confused. It seemed possible that Alissa had decided to leave. That belief did not just shape the police response, it shaped the family's internal response too. For years, the note stood between the people who missed Alissa and the possibility that something far worse had happened before she ever reached a highway out of Phoenix. The note remains one of the strangest objects in the entire case because it works too well and not well enough at the same time. According to later accounts, a handwriting expert confirmed it appeared to be in Alissa's writing. If true, that would seem to support the runaway theory. But documents do not explain the conditions under which they were written. A note can be spontaneous. It can be strategic. It can be rehearsed. It can be written under emotional pressure. It can be written long before the day it is found. It can be genuine in form and still false in meaning. That is why the note never ended the case, even when it dominated it. It explained too much too fast, while leaving the rest of her life unexplained. Why leave without a car? Why leave without money from the bank? Why leave behind a phone? Why leave clothes and personal items? Why vanish so completely that decades later nothing clearly verifiable ever emerged in California or anywhere else? A note can tell you where someone says they are going. It cannot tell you if they ever took even one step toward getting there. The room added another layer of ambiguity. Sarah later described coming home and finding Alissa's bedroom disturbed. That image has stayed in the public memory because it can be read in opposing ways, just like almost everything else. A room can look wrecked because a teenager left in anger. A room can look wrecked because someone wanted it to look that way. A room can look wrecked because time and memory have fused panic and disorder into one lasting picture. In real cases, this is where storytelling often becomes dangerous. A disordered room is not a body. It is not blood. It is not a confession. It is not even necessarily evidence of violence. But it does matter as part of atmosphere. Because the first sensory memory connected to Alissa's disappearance is not a trail leading outward. It is a room that seemed to say something had ruptured in place. That is very different from the mythology of a runaway. Runaways are supposed to slip away quietly and opportunistically. They do not usually leave behind the feeling that a scene has been staged or shattered. And then there are the things she did not take. Over the years, this became one of the most damaging problems for the original runaway narrative. Alissa's car stayed behind. Her cell phone stayed behind. Her makeup and jewelry stayed behind. Her clothes stayed behind. Reporting has also noted that the money she had saved remained untouched in the bank. Each item by itself can be explained away. Teenagers make irrational decisions. They leave in haste. They expect to come back. They think they can manage with less than they need. But all of those things together create a very different impression. They suggest either a departure that was not meant to be permanent or a departure that never really happened at all. This is where the case begins to harden emotionally for viewers and investigators alike, because the farther you move from the moment of disappearance, the less the runaway theory resembles a plan and the more it resembles a narrative wrapper placed over an absence that no one knew how to confront. Yet the uncomfortable truth is that weak theories can survive for years when they arrive early enough. In 2001, the case did not immediately become the kind of high-pressure, missing teen investigation that floods a city with urgency. It settled into the slower category of presumed choice. For the people inside the family, that meant grief without permission. You cannot fully mourn a runaway because the story tells you they chose to leave. You also cannot stop wondering why they have not come back. Sarah has spoken about the hurt she felt then. Not the hurt of bereavement, but the hurt of abandonment. That emotional state becomes part of the tragedy because it shows how a misleading first explanation can divide the living from the missing person they love. If Alissa was dead on the day she disappeared, then for years the people around her were not only denied answers. Some were denied the right kind of sorrow. They were left grieving someone who had supposedly made a decision not to return. That is a quieter kind of cruelty than physical violence, but in some cases it lasts even longer. Time did what time often does in unresolved cases. It thickened the silence. Days became months, months became years. No verified sighting restored the runaway story to life. No phone call settled it. No bank activity. No clear trace in California. No known attempt to reclaim the belongings left behind in Phoenix. The case did not resolve into a fugitive adulthood. It stayed where it started. In the house, in the school. In the gap between Michael's account and everyone else's inability to test it. Sarah later said the family moved to another home not long after, and she remembered being struck by the fact that no new bedroom was prepared for Alissa. That detail is not legal proof of anything. Families respond to missing loved ones in different and often contradictory ways. Some preserve rooms untouched forever. Some cannot bear the sight of them. But details like that matter in a documentary sense because they reveal emotional assumptions. To keep a room ready is to act as though someone might return. To dismantle that space too quickly can suggest a different kind of certainty. Again, the case offers no simple translation, only a detail that sits in the mind because it seems to reveal what people believed before they said it aloud. What makes the first years of this case especially difficult is how little movement there seemed to be. A missing teenager, a note, a stepfather's story, a family suspended between acceptance and doubt. If the story had ended there, it would still be tragic, but it might not have become the national case it is now. What changed everything was not a breakthrough in Arizona. It was a false confession from far away. In 2006, a convicted murderer in Florida named Thomas Heimer appeared to confess to killing Alissa. For a moment, it looked like the case might take a familiar and terrible shape. A transient predator, a long-distance answer, a hidden burial. Investigators flew out to question him. Then they concluded the confession was false. It did not solve the case. But it did something almost as important. It forced the disappearance back into motion. Once detectives reopened the file and began looking closely again, the original assumptions around the case started to break apart. False confessions do not just waste time. They can redirect a case into uncomfortable truth, because they force police to revisit everything they once accepted. After the Florida confession collapsed, detectives in Phoenix took another look at Alissa's disappearance, and this time, they did not stop at the note. Reporting in later years described how investigators conducted hundreds of interviews with relatives, friends, co-workers, and people from Alissa's world. This was the phase when private family history began moving into public suspicion. People who knew Alissa reportedly described Michael as controlling and invasive. Friends said he made them uneasy. Family members described an atmosphere in the house that now seemed less like strict parenting and more like domination. Sarah would later become the public face of those memories, but importantly, she was not the first family member to suspect Michael. By her own account, she was one of the last. That reversal is part of what gives the case some of its emotional force. The child who most fully believed the runaway story eventually became the adult who could no longer live inside it. As detectives turned their attention toward Michael, the case shifted from missing person mystery to something more intimate and more volatile. The question was no longer simply, where did Alissa go? It was whether she had ever truly left the orbit of home at all. This is where many retellings get tempted into certainty, because the pattern of later allegations is dramatic. There were claims of hidden surveillance, claims of phone recording, claims that Michael monitored Alissa intensely and limited her movements. There were accounts that he made other adults uncomfortable. There were suggestions that he feared losing control as she grew older and more independent. Those details create a powerful psychological theory. They also need discipline. None of them by themselves establish murder. None of them can substitute for a body or a witnessed act or a forensic scene. But taken together, they do something else. They make the official story of a self-directed disappearance feel less natural. They force the viewer to ask not whether the house was perfect, because it clearly was not, but whether the conditions of that house made Alissa's disappearance less likely to be voluntary than it first appeared. At some point, suspicion moved beyond interviews and into search activity. By late 2008, investigators executed a search warrant at Michael Turney's home in connection with the renewed investigation into Alissa's disappearance. What they found there did not solve the case. It did, however, transform public understanding of the man at its center. According to an FBI press release issued after a later plea, Michael admitted possessing 26 pipe bombs discovered during the search, along with other illegal devices. Federal prosecutors said those weapons were found during a search connected to the investigation into Alissa's 2001 disappearance. A separate and deeply alarming case emerged from that discovery. Authorities said Michael had built an arsenal and was tied to a bombing plot directed at a local electrical workers' union. In 2010, he pleaded guilty to unlawful possession of unregistered destructive devices. That conviction eventually sent him to prison for years. None of it proved he killed Alissa, but it destroyed any lingering illusion that investigators were circling an ordinary misunderstood parent who had simply been unlucky enough to be present on the day a teenager ran away. This is one of the most difficult parts of the story to handle responsibly because the bombs are both central and potentially misleading. They are central because they changed everything about the public case. They confirmed that Michael was capable of secrecy and extremity on a frightening scale. They gave detectives a way into his world. They made it easier for outsiders to believe the darkest theory about Alissa. But they are also potentially misleading because criminal dangerousness in one area is not proof of guilt in another. The law treats those distinctions seriously for good reason. A person can be guilty of stockpiling bombs and still not be legally proven to have killed a missing stepdaughter. Documentary storytelling is tempted to merge the two because the emotional logic feels obvious. A man who hides bombs could hide a murder, but emotion is not evidence. The most honest way to frame this is simpler. The search tied to Alissa's case revealed Michael as far more dangerous and unstable than the original runaway narrative ever suggested. It did not tell investigators where Alissa was or what happened to her after she left school. For a long time, that was where the story remained. Michael went to federal prison on the weapons case. Alissa stayed missing. The renewed suspicion around the house did not immediately produce a homicide charge. That gap matters because it shows just how hard the case was. Investigators may have had a theory. They may have had witness accounts. They may have believed they understood the shape of what happened. But belief is not enough. The absence of a body hollowed out the prosecution path from the beginning. There was no crime scene that could be shown to a jury. No forensic sequence. No official time of death. No independent witness to violence. The case lived in inferences, in behavior, in contradictions, in what people close to Alissa later said they had seen or felt. That can be enough to fuel public certainty for years. It is often not enough to satisfy a courtroom. Meanwhile, the emotional center of the story shifted to Sarah Turney. For years, she had defended her father. Then she began reading police reports and confronting the case in a different way. She has spoken openly about the shock of realizing that many people in her own family had suspected Michael long before she did. That transition from believer to accuser became one of the most compelling parts of the case in the public eye, not because it solved anything, but because it demonstrated how powerfully the original story had been absorbed by the people closest to it. Sarah was not some distant internet advocate. She was the younger sister who grew up in the same house and initially accepted the runaway explanation. When she changed her mind, she did not do so quietly. She began using social media. She started a podcast called Voices for Justice. She released home video clips and family memories into public view. She helped turn the case from a local cold file into a national conversation. In another era, the story might have stayed buried in Phoenix paperwork. Instead, it entered a new phase where digital attention became investigative pressure. Social media advocacy can cheapen a case if it turns grief into spectacle. In Alissa's story, it had the opposite effect. Sarah's campaign gave the public access, not just to a missing person image, but to the strange architecture of the family itself. People heard old recordings. They saw fragments of home video. They encountered the awkwardness and discomfort that later defined the public understanding of Michael. None of this was neutral, of course. Advocacy by a family member always carries interpretation with it, but it also did something traditional reporting had struggled to do. It restored Alissa as a person and the house as a place. Suddenly, the case was not just a line on a poster. It was a living argument over what kind of environment she had been trying to survive. And because the campaign came from someone who had once defended Michael, it carried a special weight. Sarah was not saying, "This is what I always knew." She was saying, "This is what I can no longer deny." By 2020, the pressure and accumulated investigative work led to a dramatic development. A Maricopa County grand jury indicted Michael Turney on a charge of second-degree murder in Alissa's presumed death. The county attorney's office stated that on the day she vanished, Alissa had been seen at school telling her boyfriend that her stepfather was taking her out early and that she had never been seen or heard from again. The arrest felt to many like a delayed moral correction. After nearly 2 decades of silence and suspicion, the state was finally willing to say in a courtroom that this was not just a runaway case and not just a missing person case. It was a murder case. That distinction meant everything emotionally. It told the family that at least on paper the state no longer accepted the old explanation. But it also set a trap. Once the case entered court, the narrative had to survive a level of scrutiny that internet certainty never faces. When the arrest happened, Sarah and her then-boyfriend were reportedly still living with Michael. The shock of that detail adds another eerie layer to the story. Imagine building adult life in proximity to the man who had anchored your understanding of childhood. Imagine learning that prosecutors now believed he had murdered the sister whose disappearance defined your family. Such reversals are not clean or cinematic in real life. They are destabilizing. They force every old memory to shift shape. A harmless comment becomes ominous. A rule becomes control. A blank space becomes evidence of what was hidden there. This is why cases like Alissa's are so psychologically intense. They are not only about a missing person, they are about the retroactive rewriting of family reality. And yet, even that rewriting can overshoot the evidence. The danger after an arrest is that people begin speaking as though the moral story and the legal story are now identical. In this case, they were not. The prosecution theory was straightforward in its broad outline, even if it lacked the physical proof people expect. Michael was allegedly the last person with Alissa after he took her from school. He reported her as a runaway. Investigators and family members believed the runaway note did not reflect a genuine departure. Over time, police came to view Michael as the primary suspect based on witness accounts and the surrounding circumstances. That theory had narrative power because it fit what many already believed. A controlling man loses control of a teenage girl who is nearing adulthood. She disappears. He provides the explanation before anyone else can. Years later, the family peels back the story and points back toward him. It is a compelling sequence. It is also still a sequence without a body. without a murder weapon, without a known disposal site, without a verified scene of death. That absence mattered the moment trial began in 2023. The case against Michael was not going to hinge on forensic revelation. It was going to hinge on whether the totality of circumstantial evidence was enough to let a jury infer that Alissa was dead and that he was responsible. Over several days, witnesses testified about the family dynamic and the timeline. Sarah described a troubled relationship between Michael and Alissa. She testified about hidden cameras and recordings. Other witnesses discussed what they knew of Alissa and her life. The state tried to build a structure from the parts it had. Last sighting, home environment. Note, missing belongings that were not missing because they were left behind. Years of silence, Michael's conduct. But the defense attacked the foundation itself. If you cannot prove a death, if you cannot prove when it happened, if you cannot show a scene, if you cannot show physical evidence linking the defendant to a killing, then what exactly is the jury being asked to convict on? Suspicion, character, the feeling that the story points in one direction. In July 2023, before the defense even had to present its full case, the judge granted a motion for acquittal. The ruling meant the court found the prosecution had not offered substantial evidence to support a conviction. It was one of the sharpest and most painful moments in the case, because it created a kind of double truth. Publicly, many people remained convinced Michael was responsible. Legally, the state had not cleared the threshold. The defense emphasized exactly what was missing. No body, no crime scene, no physical evidence proving a murder took place. For the family, and for people who had followed Sarah's campaign, the acquittal felt devastating. For Michael, it was vindication. He left custody, insisting he did not kill Alissa, and saying he loved his children. The legal case had ended not with clarity, but with a reopened wound. The same void that had defined 2001 was still there in 23. The only difference was that now the country had watched the state approach that void and fail to bridge it. This is the point where many true crime narratives make a mistake. They treat acquittal as either the triumphant exposure of a false case or the infuriating escape of an obvious killer. Alissa Turney's case resists both simplifications. The acquittal does not prove Michael innocent in any factual sense beyond the legal presumption he already held. It proves the prosecution could not present enough admissible evidence to convict. That is not the same claim. At the same time, the arrest and indictment do not prove guilt, simply because they align with a persuasive public theory. This tension is what makes the case so enduring. Almost everyone who studies it ends up feeling the pull of one explanation, but the actual file remains full of holes large enough to matter. We do not know where Alissa died if she died in 2001. We do not know how. We do not know whether the note was freely written that day, or used from some earlier moment, or created under pressure. We do not know what happened between school dismissal and the evening runaway report. Beyond Michael's own description, those missing answers are not technicalities, they are the case. Still, the strongest explanation remains the one investigators eventually pursued. If you strip the story down to its most durable facts, the runaway theory is surprisingly weak. 17-year-old girl leaves school early because her stepfather is taking her. She is never independently seen again. A note says California. But the life she supposedly abandoned remains physically untouched. Her money stays in place. Her car stays in place. Her personal items stay in place. There is no verified adult life under a new identity, no stable trail of self-directed disappearance, no confirmed communication after the fact. Add to that the later testimony about a highly controlled home and a stepfather whose broader conduct was alarming enough to lead to a federal weapons conviction after a search tied to her case. Then add the fact that other family members reportedly suspected him long before the arrest. As a rational explanation, the idea that Alissa simply chose to vanish forever on that one afternoon becomes difficult to sustain. But saying the strongest explanation is homicide by someone inside the home does not end the analysis. It raises another question. How strong is the evidence that the someone was Michael specifically, rather than the case simply being shaped around him because he was the obvious center? This is where the story becomes most uncomfortable for viewers who want certainty. There are powerful reasons to suspect him. There are also serious evidentiary limits. The case appears to depend heavily on his being the last known adult with Alissa and on a broad pattern of alleged control and deception. In many no-body cases, that can be enough if accompanied by forensic traces or statements or a disposal narrative. Here those extra pieces were missing. Even Michael's disturbing arsenal and bombing plot, while psychologically relevant, did not speak directly to what happened to Alissa. The result is a case that may feel morally settled to many people, and yet remains materially unresolved. Could Alissa really have run away? To ask that honestly is not to endorse it, but to test the only major alternative. Teenagers do leave home abruptly. They do write notes. They do leave behind belongings. They do disappear into networks friends and relatives know little about. The existence of a California connection through her aunt gave the note at least surface plausibility. And if the writing was indeed hers, then the simplest reading is still that she wrote what she wrote. The problem is what happened next. A voluntary departure has to produce life somewhere. It has to interact with the world. It has to create traces over 20-plus years. The longer none appear, the more that theory collapses under its own missing weight. A teenager vanishing without documented employment, banking, housing, relationships, or recontact is possible. It is just not the strongest reading of this case. Could someone outside the family have harmed her after she returned home? That is another theoretical possibility. If Michael's account were true, and he dropped her off around 1, then the window for an outside offender opens. But again, the case offers no support structure for that idea beyond abstract possibility. No witness places her elsewhere that afternoon. No known abductor enters the picture. No credible confession. The one confession that did surface from Florida was determined to be false. In some cases, uncertainty genuinely points outward in many directions. Here, the uncertainty keeps curving back toward the same small orbit. School. Michael. Home. Note. Report. Silence. One reason the story remains powerful is that it has two missing persons at its center. The obvious one is Alissa. The less obvious one is the version of truth that might have existed in the first hours before the runaway narrative set like concrete. What if the case had been treated from the beginning as suspicious? What if the room had been processed with homicide-level urgency? What if every step of Michael's timeline had been scrutinized before memory cooled? What if the house had been searched immediately? Cold cases are full of these agonizing questions, not because they guarantee a different outcome, but because early assumptions often determine how much later truth is even recoverable. In Alissa's case, the classification of runaway may have cost investigators the very window in which physical evidence could have existed. If a crime occurred that day, then the first story told about it may also have been the first layer of successful concealment. This is where Alissa's case quietly overlaps with many of the best-known disappearances, even though the setting is completely different. The essential horror is not wilderness or ocean or remoteness. It is narrative capture. It is the moment when the wrong explanation arrives early, and everyone is forced to live under it. For years, Alissa was the girl who ran away. That label organized police expectations. It organized family grief. It organized public memory. By the time the state reimagined her as a probable homicide victim, the material world of 2001 was long gone. Rooms had changed. Houses had changed. People had moved. Memories had hardened and also blurred. Whatever happened to her had enjoyed the protection of time. That may be the cruelest detail of all. Not just that she vanished, but that the explanation for her disappearance may have helped the truth disappear with her. And yet, her case refused to stay buried. That refusal came largely through Alissa Turney's work. There is something deeply moving and also deeply sad about the role she has played. She was once the child who believed her sister had chosen to leave. Then she became the adult who spent years trying to reverse the damage of that belief both privately and publicly. In interviews, Sarah has said she carries guilt over how long it took her to change her mind. But that guilt may say less about her than about the power of family authority and childhood dependence. Children do not naturally suspect the adults who raise them of unthinkable acts. They absorb explanations because they have to in order to survive the house they live in. The tragedy is not that Sarah believed the runaway story. The tragedy is that if the story was false, it worked exactly as intended. It isolated Alissa not only in absence, but in memory. There is another layer to the case that makes it especially difficult for an audience. Alissa herself is partially hidden behind the public battle that followed. The media narrative often shifts quickly from her life to Michael and Sarah. He becomes the suspect. She becomes the crusading sister. But beneath that structure is a girl whose final year of life is still only visible in fragments. A boyfriend, a job, friends who later spoke about discomfort around her home, a sense that she wanted some kind of independence. A line in a class doorway saying she was being taken out early. That is almost all the public gets. Perhaps that is why the case hits as hard as it does. Many mysteries leave behind too much chaos. This one leaves behind too little personhood. The viewer is forced to imagine an ordinary teenager living through tensions she may not have fully known how to describe, and then disappearing before adulthood could even begin. If you look closely, the case contains a recurring pattern of substitution. The note substitutes for a search. The bombs substitute emotionally for proof of murder. Public conviction substitutes for legal conviction. A sister's advocacy substitutes for institutional urgency that came too late. Even the trial itself can feel like a substitute for resolution because it created the shape of accountability without the outcome of it. This is why the story is so haunting in a restrained way, not because it is full of shocking twists, but because every time it approaches closure, something thinner but more ambiguous slides into place instead. An explanation, a confession, a search, an arrest, a trial. Each seems like the thing that will finally answer the question, and each collapses into another form of incompletion. The case also exposes how strongly people want private evil to become legible. Once the world learned about the surveillance allegations and the bombs, it became easy to picture Michael as the final answer to every open question. Maybe he is. Maybe the public instinct is right. But one reason the acquittal hit so hard is that it reminded everyone how much of the case still lives in inference. Courts do not convict on atmosphere. They do not convict because a man seems frightening. They require evidence that can survive structured doubt. In one sense, that can feel maddening. In another, it is the whole point of law. The emotional frustration viewers feel toward the outcome is not proof the court failed. It is proof the case occupies the painful middle ground between suspicion and demonstration that may be unsatisfying. It is also honest. None of this means Michael should be viewed as a neutral figure. He remains the pivotal figure in the case for reasons that are not accidental. He was the last known person with Alissa after she left school. He supplied the story that framed the disappearance. Investigators eventually pursued him as the primary suspect. Family members and friends described a controlling environment around him. The search of his home in connection with the case uncovered devices so dangerous they led to a separate federal prosecution. These are not small or incidental facts. They are the central gravity of the entire file. The difficulty is that gravity is not the same as proof. It is possible for the strongest theory to be true and still not be prosecutable. That is one of the hardest truths true crime audiences often resist, because we are conditioned to think narrative convergence should produce legal resolution. Real cases often break that expectation. If there is a single image that captures the whole story, it may not be the bombs or the courtroom or even the missing poster. It may be that school doorway. A teenager on the last day before summer. A boy in woodshop class. A casual sentence about getting picked up early. It is such a normal image that it almost disappears inside itself, and then the rest of her life never follows it. That is what makes the scene unbearable. Not dramatic violence, not a witnessed abduction, just a final ordinary moment before reality becomes dependent on someone else's account. Every unresolved case has a border between the shared world and the private world. For Alissa, that border was a sentence in a school hallway and a ride no one else saw. The more you sit with the story, the more you realize how much of it is built on timing. If the note had not appeared immediately, perhaps police would have moved differently. If the false confession had not surfaced in Florida, perhaps the case would have slept even longer. If the search warrant in 2008 had not uncovered bombs, perhaps Michael would never have become a nationally recognized suspect. If Sarah had never turned to social media, the story might have remained local. If the prosecution had found one more piece of physical evidence, perhaps the 2023 trial ends differently. The entire case is a chain of near moments, near urgency, near answers, near accountability. That accumulation of almost is part of what makes the story so exhausting and so compelling. It never fully dies and never fully resolves. What then can be said with confidence? Alissa Turney disappeared on May 17, 2001, when she was 17. She was last seen at school around 11 that morning. She told her boyfriend her stepfather was taking her out early. Michael later said he took her to lunch and dropped her at home. He reported her missing that evening and said she had left a note about going to California. She has never been found. Over the years, the runaway explanation eroded under the weight of what she left behind and what people later said about the home she lived in. A renewed investigation shifted suspicion toward Michael. A search connected to the case led to a separate bombs prosecution. In 2020, he was indicted for second-degree murder and Alissa's presumed death. In 2023, a judge granted an acquittal after ruling the state had not presented substantial evidence for conviction. The case remains unsolved. That is the documentary core. Everything else lives in interpretation, and interpretation is where viewers have to be most disciplined. The strongest rational reading is that Alissa did not simply start a new life in California and stay silent for decades. The strongest rational reading is that something catastrophic happened close to home and close to the last person known to be with her. But the moment you move from that proposition to the details of how and where and exactly when you step back into darkness, was the note written under pressure or repurposed from some earlier moment? Did anything happen at lunch? Did anything happen at home? Was she alive after 1 in the afternoon? If not, where did the trail end? If so, who besides Michael ever saw her? These are not dramatic embellishments. They are the locked doors of the case. Until one of them opens, the story remains suspended between profound suspicion and irreducible uncertainty. There is also the human question of what justice means in a case like this. Is it a conviction, a body recovered, a confession, a new witness? Some cases survive long enough that justice becomes multiple things at once. For Sarah, it appears to mean keeping Alissa present in public memory so the case cannot be flattened back into the old runaway label. For investigators, it may mean finding one piece of hard evidence that can turn atmosphere into proof. For viewers, it may simply mean refusing the comfort of the easy explanation. Sometimes, justice begins not with answers, but with the rejection of a false story. In Alissa's case, that rejection already happened. The world no longer sees her primarily as a runaway. But moral correction is not factual resolution. It is only the first step. One of the reasons SilentEcho returns again and again to cases like this is that they reveal something profoundly unsettling about the way disappearance works. We imagine vanishing as a physical event, a body removed from space. But often the more consequential vanishing is narrative. A person is folded into a story that erases them while pretending to explain them. In Alissa's case, the note may have done that work. It spoke in her voice, or seemed to. It told others where to look, and perhaps just as importantly, where not to look. Whether or not it was written freely, the result was the same. For years, the world looked at a choice where there may have been coercion. It looked at departure where there may have been erasure. And by the time the story was challenged, The original material world had already gone cold. Even now, the case continues to expand through documentaries, interviews, podcasts, and ongoing advocacy. That persistence is not just a sign of internet obsession. It is a sign that the central question has never been answered in a way people can live with. Who was Alissa in those final months? What did she believe about her own future? Was she counting down to adulthood and escape in the ordinary sense of moving out? Did she think she could make it to 18? Did she write that note as a fantasy? A decoy? A plea? A surrender? We do not know. The case holds on because it contains both a concrete suspect structure and a devastating absence of final proof. It offers just enough shape for the mind to keep circling, and just enough emptiness to keep that circling alive. The older cases get, the more they expose the limits of memory. Witnesses age, stories simplify, motivations become cleaner than they were. It is possible that some recollections about the Turney household sharpened over time because later suspicion made earlier discomfort feel more meaningful. It is also possible that those recollections were accurate all along and simply went underweighted until too late. The honest approach is to allow both possibilities to exist while still recognizing where the evidence points most strongly. That kind of restraint is not weakness. It is the only way to respect a case that has already suffered from overly easy explanations. The public once accepted a simple story that said, Alissa ran away. It would be a different kind of mistake to replace that with a new simple story that pretends every unresolved detail has been settled. And still one question keeps surviving every effort to domesticate it. If Alissa truly ran away, then where is the rest of her life? There should be traces, not just rumors or emotional intuition, but traces. Documents, relationships, wages, identified remains under another name. Something. The silence after 2001 is not normal. It is not the ordinary silence of a teenager cutting ties. It is the silence of disappearance in the deepest sense. A life abruptly sealed off from the observable world. That is why the case remains so disturbing, even after the acquittal and the failed prosecution. Because whatever the legal outcome, the disappearance itself still behaves like an act done to someone rather than a choice made by them. There is another image that lingers too, not from the day she vanished, but from what followed. Sarah growing up with her sister's belongings. Years going by. The public story hardening around a note, then the shock of opening the file and finding a different possibility staring back. Cases like this often turn on one person's refusal to leave the past arranged as it was. Sarah refused. She dug into records. She spoke publicly. She allowed her own memories to be rewritten by evidence and testimony that hurt to confront. Without that effort, there may never have been an arrest at all. The fact that the trial failed does not erase the significance of that work. It changed the official memory of the case. It pulled Alissa back out of the runaway category and into the harder, more honest space she had perhaps occupied from the first day. What remains now is not closure, but pressure. Pressure on the truth. Pressure on time. Pressure on anyone who knows more than they have said. Cold cases do sometimes break after decades, not because the mystery was always unsolvable, but because people age into different relationships with guilt, fear, loyalty, and mortality. Someone may remember something differently. Someone may decide silence is no longer worth carrying. Someone may reveal a place, a sentence, an object, a mistake. That hope is not fantasy. It is often the only reasonable future an unsolved case has left. But hope should not be confused with expectation. For the family, the hardest reality may be that the next decisive development never comes. They may be asked to live with suspicion instead of certainty forever. If that happens, this case will still stand as a warning about how easily a disappearance can be disguised by familiarity. No masked stranger needed to snatch Alissa from a highway shoulder. No wilderness needed to erase tracks. All it took was a normal day and an explanation that arrived fast enough to slow everything else down. That is what makes the case feel so cold, even after so many years. It is not only about what may have happened to one girl. It is about how truth can be delayed by the shape of family and by the authority of the person who speaks first. In that sense, Alissa did not just disappear. She was interpreted out of sight. So we return to the beginning. A bright Phoenix morning. The last day before summer. A brief stop at a boyfriend's class. A sentence about being picked up early. Then one account. One note. One evening report. And after that, a silence so complete that it consumed decades. The state tried to name what filled that silence and could not prove it in court. Her sister tried to break it in public and still has not received the one answer that matters. Michael Turney has maintained he is innocent. The law at trial did not prove otherwise. But the old story that Alissa simply left and built a hidden life somewhere else feels thinner every year. The case remains suspended between those truths. Not resolved, not finished, not gone. For all the documents and testimony and headlines, the enduring question is still painfully simple. What actually happened after Alissa Turney walked out of school on May 17, 2001? Did she ever make it home alive in the ordinary sense of arriving and continuing her day? Was the note the beginning of her own plan or the beginning of someone else's cover? Did the truth die in that house? In that car? On that afternoon? Or is it somehow still out there waiting in the memory of one person who has never spoken plainly enough? Until that answer arrives, the case will keep doing what it has done for almost a quarter of a century. It will draw people back, not because it is sensational, but because it is unresolved in the most intimate way possible. A teenager vanished from the center of an ordinary life, and the ordinary world still cannot account for her. And that may be why this story hits with such strange force, not because it offers spectacle, but because it withholds it. There is no final image of crisis, no dramatic chase, no confirmed burial ground in the desert. There is only a house full of tension, a note full of uncertainty, a family split by belief, a man many people suspect, and a court that could not convict him. In that gap between conviction and proof, Alissa's life remains suspended. She is not only the subject of an unsolved case, she is also the measure of how much truth can be lost when the first version of events is wrong and the correction comes years too late. If you listen closely, the case does not end with the judge's ruling in 2023. It ends every day that Alissa is still missing. Every day her family wakes up without a body to bury or a verified last location or a statement they can trust. Every day the strongest theory remains just short of legal completion. Every day the same impossible arithmetic continues. A girl goes missing. A note appears. Nothing that should have followed ever follows. That is the silence at the center of Alissa Turney's story. Not empty silence, but organized silence. Directed silence. A silence that may have been built, piece by piece, from the first afternoon, and then preserved by time. If one day this case is solved, it may come through something small. Not a cinematic breakthrough, but a practical one. A location. A witness who finally talks. A document revisited. A statement compared against another statement after enough years have passed. Cold cases often open along their weakest seam. Until then, all anyone can do is hold the shape of what is known and resist the temptation to flatten what is not. Alissa was real. Her disappearance was real. The original runaway explanation is deeply compromised by everything that followed. The suspicion around Michael Turney is not random and did not emerge from nowhere. The acquittal is also real and legally significant. Those truths have to coexist whether we like it or not. That is where we leave the case tonight. Not at a solved ending, but at the point where the story remains most alive. A teenager on the threshold of adulthood. A home that many people later described as controlled and unsettling. A final school sighting. A note. A long silence. An arrest. An acquittal. And somewhere beneath all of that, the missing final hours of a life that should have continued. To understand why the case became so polarized, it helps to slow down and look at how teenage runaway cases were often treated at the time. In 2001, police departments across the United States dealt with a constant flow of reports involving minors who left home for a day or two and then returned. That pattern can create its own blindness. If a note exists and a destination seems plausible and there are no obvious injuries or signs of forced entry, the institutional impulse is often to downgrade the alarm. In hindsight, that can feel heartless. In practice, it is one reason some cases sink before they are understood. The category of runaway is not just descriptive. It controls urgency. It decides what kind of resources move and how fast. It shapes the questions officers ask and the ones they do not. In Alissa's case, this may be one of the most consequential facts in the entire story. The first explanation was not only accepted, it became operational. It told everyone where the center of gravity was supposed to be, somewhere beyond Phoenix, somewhere west, somewhere chosen. Once that lens was in place, the subtler signs of danger were easier to miss or dismiss, not because they were invisible, but because they no longer fit the assigned story. Think about what the note did psychologically. It did not only inform, it relieved. It gave a chaotic event the appearance of intention. A missing girl is terror. A runaway girl is conflict. Terror demands an immediate search for harm. Conflict suggests waiting for emotion to cool. That distinction can alter everything. For younger family members, it can even become a survival mechanism. If the note is true, then the person who left may be angry, selfish, impulsive, hurtful, but she is still alive. If the note is false, then something far darker may have already happened, and the adults closest to you may know more than they are saying. Most children and even many adults will choose the first interpretation because it is easier to bear. This is one reason the case is not merely about evidence. It is about belief under pressure. Who could tolerate what story? Who needed which story to be true? And how long can a family live inside an explanation before it starts to feel like the walls of the house itself? There is also the particular cruelty of a disappearance that happens on a school day. Schools are spaces of attendance and accountability. Bells ring. Teachers mark names. Friends remember outfits and moods and little jokes that would vanish on any other afternoon. When someone disappears from that environment, the last known hours take on a terrifying clarity. Alissa was not crossing a remote landscape. She was being moved out of a public institution back into private space. That transition matters. School is a place with witnesses. Home is not. In missing person cases, the border between public and private often determines whether truth survives. If something happened to Alissa after she left school, the last public moment of her life may have been that brief message to John in the workshop doorway. That is almost unbearably small, as a final verified trace. A sentence, a classroom, a boy who had no reason to think he was hearing the last ordinary line she would ever speak in public. And there is another reason that school moment feels so important. It places Michael inside the timeline before he ever speaks to police. Without John's recollection, the stepfather's role would enter the story only through his own statements. Instead, there is independent confirmation that Alissa expected him to take her. That does not tell us what he did, but it removes a whole category of alternative confusion. She was not last seen leaving campus with unknown friends or drifting into some uncertain plan. She connected her next movement directly to him. It is one of the reasons the case keeps folding back toward the same core. Too many other roads out of the mystery collapse early. Michael's own account of the afternoon is also worth lingering over because of how ordinary it sounds. Lunch, an argument, a ride home. That sequence has the smooth texture of a family dispute. Not dramatic, not memorable, not suspicious in isolation. In a way that is exactly what makes it effective. The most durable explanations in missing person cases are often the ones that lean on recognizable domestic friction. Teen argues with parent. Teen goes home angry. Teen runs. The story does not need to be vivid to work. It only needs to feel familiar. If the account was false, then its strength lies in how little it asks the listener to imagine. There is no elaborate alibi. No complicated chronology, just an afternoon any family could have had. When a case depends so heavily on one person's unobserved account, simplicity can become a form of concealment. What do we know about Alissa's life outside the home? Enough to make the total disappearance feel wrong and not enough to reconstruct her inner world with certainty. She had a boyfriend. She had friends. She worked. She seems to have been building toward adulthood in the ordinary teenage way by accumulating small freedoms and private plans. Reporting has said she had saved money and left it untouched. Sarah later argued that Alissa was planning to move out when she turned 18 rather than vanish before then. That distinction is psychologically believable because it matches how many older teenagers think. They do not always run. Sometimes they endure until they can leave with more control and fewer consequences. This is one reason the runaway note keeps feeling unstable. It suggests a dramatic immediate break. The rest of the available portrait suggests a girl perhaps counting down rather than detonating. Neither picture can be proven from the outside. But one sits more naturally beside the life traces she left. Cases like this are also shaped by the culture of the home in ways outsiders rarely understand in real time. Control does not always announce itself as terror. It often looks like rules, monitoring, explanations, excuses, family quirks that sound strange only when retold years later. Sarah's later testimony about hidden cameras and recorded calls landed so forcefully not because such claims proved murder, but because they gave the house a particular texture. A house where privacy had already been thinned, a house where being watched was normalized from the top down. Michael's response that cameras were for security preserves the formal possibility of innocence. Plenty of homeowners install surveillance. But again, the case is not about any one fact in isolation. It is about the cumulative weight of detail. The same camera can mean protection in one house and domination in another, depending on everything around it. The tragedy is that by the time the public learned these details, the one person whose daily experience might have clarified that difference was gone. Family dynamics in missing person cases are often flattened into simple moral roles: victim, protector, villain, believer, truth-teller. The Turney story refuses those easy assignments. Sarah once defended Michael. Other relatives reportedly suspected him earlier. Some family members supported the public campaign for justice, while others were more reluctant. Years later, Sarah spoke about distance and pain within the family itself. This matters because unresolved disappearances rarely damage only the missing person's life. They keep reconfiguring the lives still present. Every new theory reorganizes loyalty. Every interview reopens an old room. Even an acquittal does not settle anything emotionally, because the family is not deciding beyond reasonable doubt. It is deciding what version of memory it can survive. That process can split siblings who all believe the same core thing but cannot bear the same public path toward it. The 2008 search warrant remains one of the most cinematic moments in the story, and also one of the most dangerous to overuse. It is easy to let the discovery of bombs swallow the case because it feels like the point at which ordinary suspicion turns into Gothic revelation. Detectives search a house connected to a missing teen and instead uncover 26 pipe bombs and other destructive devices. The image almost writes itself. But if we let that image dominate too much, we lose what makes Alissa's disappearance uniquely disturbing. The bombs are loud evidence. Her case is mostly quiet evidence. The bombs show what Michael was capable of in one dimension. They do not tell us how private coercion might have worked in another. They do not replace the missing hours on May 17th. In some ways, the bombs are a distraction as much as a revelation, because they tempt the mind into a false sense of solved darkness. We think we have seen the monster, and therefore understand the crime. But the actual disappearance remains stubbornly plain and undocumented. That mismatch between spectacular danger and invisible disappearance is part of why the case still resists closure. When detectives said that putting Michael in prison for the bombs was not justice for Alissa, they were acknowledging something profound about the case. The weapons conviction may have removed a dangerous man from society for a time. It may have validated police concern about him. It may even have given the family a partial sense that something hidden in the house had finally surfaced. But partial justice can freeze a case too. Once Michael was in federal prison, the urgency around the original disappearance did not automatically intensify into a murder charge. The world could feel as though something had been handled even while the central mystery remained untouched. In cold cases, there is always a risk that a dramatic side case absorbs the energy the original victim needed. The path from 2008 to the 2020 indictment is therefore worth noticing. 12 years is a long time to live between suspicion and charge. That span tells you investigators were not sitting on a neat evidentiary package. They were navigating a case that probably felt intuitively compelling and structurally fragile at the same time. We can imagine what they had and what they lacked. They had a suspect whose behavior was alarming. They had witness accounts that made the home look troubling. They had a disappearance narrative that no longer made much sense as a voluntary vanishing. But they still lacked the physical anchor points that transformed suspicion into prosecutable certainty. Some no-body cases overcome that problem with financial motives, digital trails, blood evidence, admissions, disposal activity, or a behavior pattern so specific it becomes almost mathematical. Alissa's case appears to have had none of that in a form strong enough to be decisive. What it had was gravity, a case that kept pulling toward one man without ever fully landing on the evidence that would hold him there in court. That long delay also changed the emotional logic of the eventual indictment. By 2020, many people following the case did not experience the arrest as the beginning of a question. They experienced it as the delayed recognition of an answer they already believed. That is understandable. It is also a problem when a case finally enters trial, because juries and judges are supposed to begin somewhere else. They are supposed to begin with what the state can prove now, not what the public has come to feel. Over years of advocacy and repetition, this tension between public certainty and legal sufficiency sits at the center of the acquittal. It is one reason the result felt so shocking to people outside the courtroom, and much less surprising to defense lawyers watching the actual evidentiary burden. During trial, the state was trying to do something very difficult. It was trying to convert the accumulated emotional and circumstantial force of the case into a form that met the legal standard for second-degree murder. That requires more than establishing that Alissa is almost certainly dead. It requires more than establishing that Michael was controlling or frightening. It requires evidence from which a rational fact-finder could infer that he caused her death with the requisite criminal state of mind. The defense did not have to prove where Alissa went. It only had to show the state had not crossed that line. In no-body cases, the distance between those two tasks can be enormous. A family can be morally certain. The public can be morally certain. Detectives can be morally certain, and the legal standard can still remain unmet. That is not a flaw unique to this case. It is one of the deepest structural truths of criminal justice. The judge's acquittal did not erase the suspicion around Michael. In some ways, it intensified it, because people read the ruling as a technical escape rather than an evidentiary failure. But that reading can oversimplify what happened. The motion for acquittal is granted only when the court concludes the state has not presented substantial evidence to support conviction. In plain language, the problem was not some minor procedural loophole. The problem was that even taking the prosecution's evidence in the light most favorable to the state the case still fell short. That tells us something important. It tells us the public version of the case may feel fuller than the court version actually was. It tells us there may be details widely circulated online that either were not strong enough or not admissible enough to carry legal weight. It tells us the emptiness at the center of the file is not rhetorical. It is real. A lot of viewers instinctively recoil from that idea because the circumstantial picture still feels overwhelming. But circumstantial does not mean weak. Some circumstantial cases are incredibly strong. The question is whether the circumstances interlock tightly enough to exclude reasonable doubt. Here they did not. The defense could still point to the absence of a body and the absence of direct physical proof. It could still point to the note and argue that even if the story is strange, strangeness is not murder. It could still attack the prosecution for asking the court to infer too many hidden steps. That does not make the defense narrative satisfying. It makes it viable. And in a criminal case, viable doubt is enough. For documentary storytelling, the temptation is to repair that gap with confidence, to say what the court could not, to frame the acquittal as the law missing what the audience can plainly see. But if SilentEcho has any value, it is in resisting exactly that temptation. This case is stronger when told honestly. The unease is stronger. The tragedy is stronger. The ending is stronger. Because the real horror here is not merely that a dangerous man may have escaped conviction. It is that the truth may have been damaged beyond recovery by time and by the first story told about the disappearance. If that is what happened, then no amount of rhetorical certainty can fix it now. It is also worth considering how different the case feels when viewed through Sarah's arc rather than Michael's. Through that lens, the central event is not the indictment or even the acquittal. It is the transformation of a younger sister from passive believer in a runaway narrative into the primary public custodian of Alissa's memory. That transformation has documentary power because it mirrors the case itself. At first, Sarah believed the neat explanation. Then she encountered the rougher truth of ambiguity and conflicting evidence. Then she committed to the ambiguity rather than hiding from it. She did not solve the case. What she did was keep it from dying under its original label. In cold cases, that kind of labor matters more than people often realize. It is exhausting. It is socially costly. It is morally risky, because public accusation can never be taken back, and yet without it, many victims become only names on aging flyers. There is a subtle but important difference between believing Michael is responsible and understanding why the public came to believe it so strongly. The belief does not rest only on his being the last known person with Alissa. It also rests on the sense that he controlled the narrative after she vanished. He was not just another suspect in the periphery of a missing teen case. He was the source of the initial framework. In many disappearances, the person who speaks first shapes the boundaries of what others imagine possible. Here, that power may have been decisive. Every later suspicion has to be understood against that backdrop. If Michael is innocent, then he was the last person with Alissa and the first person to misread her disappearance in the most catastrophic way possible. If he is guilty, then he was the architect of the story that bought time. Either possibility places him at the center. There is no version of events in which he is marginal. Sometimes the case is described as a family secrets mystery. That phrase captures something real, but it can also mislead. Secrets suggest hidden knowledge shared by insiders. What makes this case so punishing is that even inside the family there does not seem to be full clarity. There are suspicions. There are old discomforts. There are things said and remembered and later reinterpreted. But there is not the clean revelation people imagine when they hear the words family secret. No one has opened a drawer and produced the final missing document. No deathbed admission has resolved the timeline. What the case really contains is not a secret preserved intact, but a truth perhaps shattered into fragments too small and too scattered to reassemble easily. That is much more realistic and much more haunting. If you wanted to build the strongest counter-argument to the dominant theory, you would focus on the note and on the danger of retroactive interpretation. You would say that once Michael became the suspect, every oddity of the household was reread through guilt. You would say that troubled families often generate exaggerated memories after catastrophe. You would say that teenagers do sometimes leave behind things they should have taken. You would remind the audience that no body means no verified death. This counterargument is not emotionally persuasive to most people who have followed the case, but it is strong enough to explain why a judge could acquit. That alone is worth dwelling on because it clarifies the true state of play. The case is not weak in the social sense. It is weak in the evidentiary sense. That distinction is everything. Even so, the alternative story still carries its own implausibilities. If Alissa ran away, Why is there no convincing post-2001 life? If she left in secret, why leave behind the practical tools of doing so? If she intended to sever contact, why does the note point to a place where she had a real family connection rather than a destination impossible to check? Why did no later trace stabilize the account? These questions do not prove homicide. They simply keep demolishing the comfort of the runaway explanation. After enough years, the absence of a new life becomes its own form of evidence, even if it is not legally enough on its own. The digital afterlife of the case has also changed how people understand missing persons. Earlier generations encountered cases through local broadcasts and anniversary articles. Alissa's case became part of a newer ecosystem where podcasts, social media clips, and online communities could repeatedly surface documents, memories, and disputed facts. That has benefits and dangers. The benefit is obvious. A case once dismissed can gain pressure and visibility. The danger is that online audiences often reward certainty over nuance. That can distort expectations when a real court demands nuance again. In some ways, the 2023 acquittal was a collision between these two worlds. The internet had spent years emotionally trying the case. The courtroom required more than emotion and found the file lacking. The distance between those outcomes tells us something important about the era we live in, as much as it does about Alissa's disappearance. For the viewer, there is a lingering need to identify the one decisive clue that would make the case feel complete: the note. The room, the cameras, the bombs, John's sighting, Sarah's testimony. The problem is that no single element can bear that weight. This is a cumulative case, or it is no case at all. That is why the story feels both powerful and diffuse. It does not hinge on one contradiction. It hinges on an entire atmosphere of contradiction. A girl said to have run away leaves behind the practical means of doing so. A household later described as heavily controlled insists on an innocent explanation. A suspect emerges through years of interviews and public pressure, but the state cannot close the final evidentiary distance. Everything in the case leans in the same direction, and yet nothing alone can force the door open. Perhaps that is why the smallest details remain the most disturbing. The fact that Alissa's final public moment was so ordinary, the fact that the story about California was available within hours, the fact that Sarah's earliest response was not fear but hurt, the fact that years passed before the case fully re-entered motion, the fact that even after a trial the deepest facts remain unspoken. Grand mysteries often survive on spectacle. This one survives on domestic precision. A note on a dresser, a school doorway, a bank balance left untouched, a home recast as a surveillance space. A man with bombs in a separate but impossible to ignore corner of the story. None of it is visually extravagant. All of it is enough to unsettle. And then there is the question of what Alissa herself understood in those final days. Did she believe she could make it to 18 and leave? Did she confide fear to friends in direct terms, or only through indirect discomfort? Did she think the tension at home was survivable, so long as graduation and adulthood kept approaching? The case offers hints, but not certainty. This matters because the emotional meaning of the note changes depending on who she was in that moment. If she was desperate and impulsive, it can look like an unfinished escape. If she was strategic and future-oriented, it can look more like a fragment seized from another context. Without her voice, the case remains vulnerable to whoever tells the story most forcefully after she is gone. One of the saddest consequences of the acquittal is that it can make people feel the case has reached its final institutional chapter when it has not. The charge failed. The disappearance did not resolve. Those are separate realities. Someone somewhere still knows more than the public record contains. Whether that person is Michael or another family member or a friend or an overlooked witness is unknown. But disappearances this concentrated rarely remain wholly ownerless. Knowledge tends to pool around them even if only in fragments. The challenge is turning fragmentary private knowledge into something speakable and testable before age and death carry it away for good. For now, the case remains one of those rare domestic vanishings that has enough documented structure to feel close and enough missing structure to stay maddeningly distant. There are stronger no-body cases in pure legal terms, and there are weaker ones in public fascination. Alissa Turney's story occupies a grim middle where the emotional evidence is overwhelming and the courtroom evidence was insufficient. That middle is where some of the most enduring mysteries live because it leaves everyone dissatisfied. The family lacks closure. The state lacks proof. The public lacks certainty. The suspect lacks conviction but not suspicion. No one gets a complete ending. That dissatisfaction is part of why people keep returning to Alissa's case, not simply because they want to accuse, but because the story violates the way truth is supposed to behave. We are taught that enough years and enough scrutiny will eventually sort lies from facts. In this case, years clarified the weakness of the runaway narrative, but did not produce a provable replacement. The old story became less believable. The new story became more believable. Yet the distance between more believable and legally demonstrable remained. That is a very specific kind of torment. It means the case grows morally sharper while staying materially incomplete. And so the final question may not only be what happened to Alissa, but what happened to the truth on the day she disappeared. Did it die quickly under a note and a familiar explanation? Did it survive in pieces inside people who were too afraid or too confused to speak? Did it get diluted by time until even honest witnesses could no longer separate memory from interpretation? Those are the questions that make this case feel larger than its file, because every unresolved disappearance is also a study in how reality gets narrated after a person cannot defend their own version of it anymore. That is why Alissa Turney's story still matters. Not because it offers the cleanest suspect or the loudest twist, but because it shows how a life can vanish inside a story that sounds plausible enough to delay the truth. A teenager leaves school early. A note says California. The world exhales too soon. Then decades pass, and all that remains is the shape of what should have been found by now, and was not. That shape is the real evidence most viewers carry away. Not a single item, not a single witness, but the outline of a life that does not behave like a voluntary disappearance at all. This is Silent Echo. If this case stayed with you, let me know what you think in the comments. If you want more real investigations told with atmosphere and restraint, subscribe to the channel and leave a like. And stay with us for the next investigation.